Now we have the last category, which is called fixed overhead variances. Now, in fixed overhead, you just have to know two different variances. So there's something called fixed overhead spending variance. Now, formula for the fixed overhead are a bit different than the other things we've learned so far. So just to let you know that upfront, so you are careful in the fixed overheads. So we have a fixed overhead spending variance. This basically means budgeted fixed overhead minus actual fixed overhead. And then there's the second one called uh, fixed overhead volume variance. Now, for formula for this would be applied fixed overhead minus budgeted fixed overhead. Okay. So just to make it clear, budgeted fixed overhead is the fixed overhead you estimate at the start of the year, means how much fixed overhead you want there to be in this year. So this is always provided in the questions, or let's say usually provided in the question. Budgeted fixed overhead is the planned overhead, uh, let's say as a planned overhead that was estimated for the year. This is a planned overhead. When we're saying actual overhead is how much you actually had in overheads, right? How much actually you paid factory rent, factory salaries, and everything like that. So actual actual fixed overhead. This is overhead, or rather fixed overhead that was actually incurred. And the last one is the applied fixed overhead. This is where people go wrong. So please remember, like we have learned in the previous classes, applied always means the rate, means how much per unit or whatever the rate in standard is given, times by how much you actually worked. For example, if the rate is in per hour, you multiply by how many hours you actually worked, like we've been doing in the previous topics, in traditional costing, activity based costing. So you multiply the rate with how much you actually used of the cost driver. Same here, if the rate is in per hour, you multiply it by the hours we actually used. If the rate is in machine hours, you multiply machine hours we actually used. If the rate is in labor cost, you multiply it by the labor cost we actually incurred. So it's actually quite easy. So applied fixed overhead will be the rate, or rather I should say fixed overhead rate multiplied by allocation base actually used, not budgeted, actually used. So that's the applied overhead formula. Again, if you've been doing the previous topics well, you would be aware of this formula. This is nothing new for us. So now obviously we're going to solve the question so I can see you and show you how to apply all of this.